Welcome back to the channel. Today's we will continue our story of a man who forced by his parents to give his house for his golden child younger brother and his family. In case you missed the part 1, I recommend you should check it out. Let us continue our story. After I kicked my parents, brother, and Emily, I immediately went to my social media and shared the story with my whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted when I set my profile to private. I posted about it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to twist the event to make me the villain. I was exactly right, but I had about an hour to get ahead of them, and I had video evidence to back up my side of the story. Being preemptive worked, and I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and his wife, aka my sister-in-law, must have been ready to write their own post. But it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie too much. My parents, Dan and Emily, had a few supporters, but not many. Plenty of others already knew how entitled they were, so they understood what had happened and accepted it. One person called me, though. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me, calling me a horrible brother and telling me I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked them. This didn't repeat. The week went by, and my parents, with Dan, showed up at my front porch, just as they had promised in their ultimatum. They rang the doorbell nonstop and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened the door just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in, but I'd installed latch chains, and I braced my body against the door to keep them out. My father and brother demanded to be let in, but I told them I was recording everything on camera and that I'd call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in the sweetest tone, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told them all to go away and never come back. My mother put on crocodile tears and asked why I couldn't just do this for Dan because he was my beloved brother. I laughed and bluntly told her I didn't love him because he had treated me like garbage for years and they had only encouraged him to do so. They were terrible parents, and Dan was a terrible brother. I told them to leave, or I'd call the police. They left easily, except for my mother's loud crying and the dirty looks from the others. I thought the mess was over, but I should have known better. Later that week, I came home on Friday evening to find a moving truck and Dan's minivan parked in my driveway. They were moving in. Dan waved at me with a smug grin. I was furious. I told them to stop, but Dan smugly said that, like it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the fakest voice imaginable, Emily tilted her head and said it was okay because Mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to her. I was filled with rage hearing those words. I locked myself in my truck and called the police. When they realized what I was doing, Emily started pounding on my window, yelling at me to stop and that I couldn't do this to her because she and Dan needed the house. She cried, asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan. I responded that this was my house, not his. Emily threatened to key my truck unless I stopped calling the police. The 911 operator heard everything, and I told her that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue. That made her back off. When the police arrived, Dan and Emily had locked themselves in my house. I showed the police my current driver's license and explained what had happened. We went to my front door and found they'd changed the lock. The old lock was on the porch, drilled out, and the drill they used was right next to it, with a Harbor Freight drill bit set. I pointed it out to the cops. My parents had called them over at some point, so when they showed up, they immediately lied and said I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie. Dan and Emily came out of my house, holding some papers. They looked smug like they'd outsmarted me. They'd printed up a fake rental agreement, but the signature wasn't mine. It was obviously forged. I told them that was fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd figure it out. I also said I'd sue if anything of mine was damaged or stolen, and I'd call CPS. Dan turned pale when I said that. My mother tried to argue that I should just do this for Dan, and I yelled back that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself. The cops intervened, and I told them I wanted them all gone. I mentioned how they drilled out my door lock, presented the fake rental agreement, and had video evidence of Emily attacking me. I said those were felonies, and I would press charges if they didn't leave. When my parents heard that, it clicked for them that they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother gave up and spoke quietly to Emily. Emily instantly started crying and ripping up the fake rental papers. An officer told her to pick up the pieces or be cited for littering. Dan started telling his kids to pack their things, and the kids were all crying. Emily and Dan tried to guilt me with a sad family routine, but I didn't falter. Dan yelled at me, asking if I was satisfied with denying them a home, and I laughed and told him he was trying to take, not share. I called him an entitled prick and said no amount of crying would make me let his family move in. The cops told him to cool it or he'd be arrested. One of the cops stuck around to make sure they all left. When Dan refused to hand over the keys to the new lock, he threw them into a storm drain. The cops scolded him, and Dan had to fish them out. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned, and I sarcastically replied that it meant I wouldn't have to deal with them anymore. I told them they had treated me so badly growing up that if Dan needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. My parents stood there, stunned. They couldn't defend their actions, and the cops looked at them with judgment. My mother cried, and my father stood there, looking defeated. Dan just held his kids, and Emily threw a tantrum on the lawn. Eventually, they all packed up and left, and I went online again to share what had happened. This time, my parents were too embarrassed to try and defend their actions. Most of the family sided with me, including the people who had previously supported them. A few weeks later, I invited half the family over for Christmas Eve at my new house. Everyone I invited showed up, even though it was a long drive. They praised me for how hard I'd worked to get my house and apologized for how badly I'd been treated. We had a great party, and I got to forget the past for a while. But about 2 hours into the party, my parents, brother, and Emily showed up uninvited. They tried to get in, but my uncle, who's my mother's brother, stood up and told them they weren't welcome. He was backed up by several relatives. My grandparents, even though they were old, joined in and told my parents they needed to actually try to treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. Emily threw a tantrum, crying about how she wanted to live in my house, and I pointed out that she wasn't even a good mother. I told her she needed to get a job and stop relying on my parents. Her eldest son started kicking and screaming at me, but my brother pulled him away. It turned into a family intervention, and Dan looked humiliated. Eventually, they left, and the party resumed. Later, Emily stopped posting passive-aggressive things about me, but then, after New Year's, she posted a new complaint about how she tried to convince my parents to buy a camper for Dan's family to use. That idea was rejected, and she removed the post shortly after. She hasn't posted much since. As for Dan, he's still struggling with his salary, and my parents aren't getting any peace. I'm pretty sure they're wishing they'd never tried to push me out now. And that's the end of this crazy story. What do you guys think? Leave your comments below, and I will see you in the next video.